If you ever thought about starting your own podcast, you should check out Riverside. Riverside is an online recording studio that lets you record podcasts and video in studio quality from anywhere. And if you click on the affiliated link in the episode description and you buy a subscription, you will also be supporting the podcast. And if you are going to start your own podcast, or you just want to continue to listen to great podcasts, you're going to need headphones or speakers. If you click on the Amazon affiliated link, you can get great deals on headphones and speakers. And if you make a purchase, it will also help support the podcast. And if you ever want to read a book I have mentioned on this podcast, I now have an affiliated link for Bookshop. All the affiliated links that I mentioned will be in the episode description for this episode. This is just a reminder that this podcast has merch and a Patreon, and if you could contribute to one of those to help keep this podcast going, I would greatly appreciate it. There were a lot of reasons why people became pirates, but it was mostly because they wanted to get rich. They wanted to drown themselves in gold. They wanted to capture more money than they could possibly spend in a lifetime. And some turned to piracy to obtain love. Or at least that's how the legend goes. Ahoy! My name is Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the 10th episode of the 3rd season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. 'Tis Season 3 o' History Shelf, and I have titled this season, Yo Ho, Yo Ho, A Pirate's Life for Me. In this season be all about pirates, the pirates and scallywags that sailed the 7 seas, and some rivers, looking for booty as they made their travels. Some of these pirates came from humble beginnings, while others surprisingly came from well-to-do families. But no matter where or who they came from, they all had one thing in common. They would be pirates. And for this week, I am talking about Samuel Bellamy. The name Samuel Bellamy may be a name that sounds familiar to you because apart from being a famous pirate that went by the nickname Black Sam, I have mentioned him before on this podcast. He showed up in the Benjamin Hornigold episode I did earlier this season. But Samuel had a life before he met Benjamin. Samuel was born around February 23rd, 1689 in Hindley, Devon, England. Samuel's parents were Stephen Bellamy and Elizabeth Payne. His parents had 6 proven children, and Samuel was the youngest. I would say that there is a good possibility that Samuel's mother either died during childbirth or she died from complications after childbirth because she was buried on February 23rd, 1689, just 3 weeks before Samuel's baptism on March 18th, 1689. At the age of 13, Samuel joined the crew of a merchant vessel. In his late teens, he joined the Royal Navy. Around the year 1715, he crossed the pond to Cape Cod. He allegedly went there because he had relatives there. The next thing that I am about to tell you is heavily surrounded in lore. Legend has it that there was a woman there that Samuel fell in love with. Her last name was Hallett. Some have reported her first name as being Maria, Mariah, or Mary. Who exactly this woman was is somewhat of a mystery. Some stories say that she was somewhere between the ages of 16 to 25, while others say that she was a lot older. In some versions of the story, her parents didn't like Samuel, and in other versions, they liked him, but they didn't think that a poor sailor was a good choice of a husband for their daughter. There are even some stories that say that she was already married. Either way, Samuel needed money to either get her parents' approval for her hand in marriage or to get money so he could take off with her away from her husband. It has even been speculated that Samuel had a wife and child and it wasn't this mystery woman, but there's no historical evidence to support this. So Samuel set sail to get some money. He teamed up with a friend of his that was either named Paul Graves, or Paul Williams. I'm going to refer to him as Paul's Grave because that was what I had seen him been referred to as the most in the sources that I read. Together they became treasure hunters. By this time, Samuel was his parents' only living son, which meant that he was to inherit the family farm. But Samuel had always longed for the sea. He was fascinated by pirates like Henry Every, that was born very close to where Samuel was born. Samuel and Paul's Grave went after the Spanish treasure fleet. In early of 1715, 12 Spanish ships left Havana. These ships were filled with gold, silver, jewels, coins, and other valuables. So, in other words, it was exactly what any treasure hunter would want. On their way to Spain, the fleet met a hurricane, and 11 of the 12 ships sank off the coast of Florida. When Samuel and Paul's Grave got to where the fleet was, every fellow treasure hunter and pirate alike had the same idea as them. They were able to find a few stray coins and jewels, but they were unable to find the real mother lode that would have made them rich. By early 1716, the Spanish had come to reclaim their treasure. Samuel and Paul's Grave and all the rest of the scavengers were ran off by the Spanish. The few stray pieces that they found was not the fortune that they were hoping for, but Samuel still needed money. So Samuel and Paul's Grave decided that they needed to become pirates. Samuel Bellamy became the pirate known as Black Sam, though he probably got the nickname Black Sam before he became a pirate because he wasn't a fan of the white powdered wigs that was in fashion, and instead he wore his long black hair in a ponytail. Samuel and Paul's Grave headed to Honduras, and there they engaged in small-scale piracy. They both commanded Paraguays. Their first ship they took was a Dutch merchant ship. Then they got an English sloop. From there they went to Cuba. There in Cuba they ran into another pirate named Henry Jennings. I mentioned Henry before in the Benjamin Hornigold episode. Henry was Benjamin's nemesis. They abandoned the small sloop that they had when they came across Henry and his fleet of 4 ships because they knew that they were outnumbered and outgunned. Samuel's crew disbanded for a short while, but the gang got back together eventually, and in April of 1716, Samuel, Paul's Grave, Henry Jennings, and fellow pirate Charles Vane, whom I've mentioned a couple times this season on this podcast, teamed up to take a French frigate. They took that frigate by approaching it acting crazy and completely naked. Both Samuel and Paul's Grave double-crossed Henry, and they took off with much of the loot. Next, Samuel would make the acquaintance of Benjamin Hornigold. It's also possible that they knew each other before Samuel became a pirate, but either way, both Samuel and Paul's Grave became crew members of Benjamin's crew. Samuel was a very experienced and very talented sailor by this point. It was not hard for him to quickly move up the ranks in Benjamin's crew. It only took Samuel a few months to be named active captain of one of Benjamin's smaller ships. He became captain of the Mary Ann in August of 1716. He paired up with fellow pirate Olivier Le Sueur, aka Olivier Labousse, which means the buzzard, in September of 1716. They turned out to be a productive team. I won't go on a little side quest and tell you all about Olivier, and he's not going to be a subject of this podcast. Well, at least not this season. Who knows what the future holds, but I make no promises. But if you have the time, Olivier is an interesting figure to read up on. I covered on the Benjamin Hornigold episode that Benjamin did not want to attack English ships. He was from England, so his reasoning could have been that he was a patriot before he was a pirate, or maybe he wanted England to keep on thinking that he was still a privateer and not a pirate. Or maybe it was a little bit of both. Benjamin refused to also attack Dutch ships because the Dutch were allies to the English. Samuel and Benjamin got along well. They agreed on a lot of things. They both liked to take ships without killing anyone, and besides from stealing, they were nice towards their victims. The one thing that they couldn't see eye to eye on was attacking English and Dutch ships. Samuel wasn't the only one on Benjamin's crew that wanted to attack any ship they wanted, no matter where they were from. In the summer of 1716, Benjamin went on a trip to the Bahamas. He only took his own ship, the Adventure, with him. You know what they say. When the cat's away, the mice will play. Samuel and Olivier took many English ships. As you can imagine, Benjamin was livid, but also shocked to find that many of his men did not share his feelings. So it was time for a vote to see if Benjamin's crew still wanted him as their captain. Over 3/4 of his men did not want him to remain as captain, and the one that they wanted to replace him with was Samuel. About 24 of his men stayed with Benjamin, but the rest went with Samuel. Samuel made his pal Palsgrave Williams his quartermaster. Together, Samuel and Olivier took several ships in the Virgin Islands. In November of 1716, he took the British trader, the Sultana. He then gave the Mary Ann to Palsgrave. Samuel's rise was rare for a pirate. It had been less than a year since he had took to sea, and he was already a captain with a command of over 90 men. He continued on with showing mercy to his captives, and this earned him the nicknames Prince of Pirates and Robin Hood of the Sea. This time was the most successful time during his pirate career. During his career, he took about 50 ships, and most of those ships were during this time. Some days he took 2 ships in one day. It was only a matter of time before his name reached the ears of pirate hunters. Woodes Rogers, the governor of the Bahamas, wanted the pirates to be dealt with, so he got quite a few British warships to guard his waters. In early 1717, Olivier thought it would be best to get out of the Caribbean, and so he left for South America. Samuel stayed. Samuel had plans to fight the British, so to do that, he was going to need a bigger boat. The Whydah was just the ship he needed, and in February of 1717 he captured the Whydah. The Whydah was a slave ship that was carrying gold and rum. The captain of the Whydah was Captain Lawrence Prince. Lawrence was taking the ship back to England, and he noticed that the Whydah was being chased by 2 ships. The ships were the Sultana and the Mary Ann. So his solution was to run because his ship was faster. This chase went on for 3 days and 300 miles. Eventually, Samuel caught up with Lawrence, and neither really wanted to fire at one another because they were on the open sea, so they couldn't repair their ships if they got damaged. And Samuel didn't want the Whydah to get damaged because he wanted the vessel. After a few shots being fired, Lawrence surrendered. Lawrence was given the Sultana by Samuel. Samuel refitted the Whydah with 28 cannons, making it, at the time, one of the most formidable pirate ships. This was a ship he could fight the British with. The gold on the ship was tens of thousands of gold coins, which equals to about $120 million in today's money. This made Samuel Bellamy the richest pirate that has ever lived. Samuel could have retired with this kind of money, but he wanted more. So he set sail for North America. They started in New York, then down to the Carolinas. During this time, Samuel took many ships, including the Anne. It was given to his quartermaster, Richard Nolan. He also got a sloop that was commanded by Captain Beer or Beers. Samuel wanted to give the captain back his ship, but he was outvoted by his crew that wanted to sink the ship because they were angry at the captain for not joining the crew. Samuel told the captain a now famous quote that we're not sure is actually true, but here's the quote. Quote, "Damn my blood. I am sorry they won't let you have your sloop again, for I scorn to do anyone a mischief, when it is not to my advantage. Damn the sloop. We must sink her, and she might be of use to you. Though damn ye, you are a sneaking puppy, and so are all those who will submit to be governed by laws which rich men have made for their own security. For the cowardly whelps have not the courage otherwise to defend what they get by their knavery. But damn ye altogether. Damn them for a pack of crafty rascals, and you, who serve them, for a parcel of hen-hearted numbskulls. They vilify us, the scoundrels do, when there is only this difference. They rob the poor under the cover of law, forsooth, and we plunder the rich under the protection of our own courage. Had you not better make one of us than sneak off after the asses of those villains for employment?" End quote. The captain told Samuel that his conscience would not allow him to break the law. Samuel replied with this quote, quote, "You are a devilish conscientious rascal, damn ye. I am a free prince, and I have so much authority to make war on the whole world, as he who has 100 sail of ships at sea, and an army of 100,000 men in the field. But there is no arguing with such sniveling puppies, who allow superiors to kick them about deck at pleasure, and pin their faith upon a pimp of parson, and a squab who neither practices nor believes what he puts upon the chuckle-headed fools he preaches to." End quote. Samuel headed to New England, and if you believe the legend, he was returning to his love. But fate would have other plans for Samuel Bellamy. On April 26, 1717, Samuel's ship ran into a storm near what is today Wellfleet, Massachusetts. The ship ran into shallow waters and it sank. There were 2 survivors out of the 146 men, and Samuel was one of the ones that perished at sea. There were 100 bodies that washed up on shore, and those were buried in shallow graves. Samuel was not one of the 100. The rest of the men now belonged to Davy Jones's locker. The valuables were also washed ashore, and, of course, people quickly collected what was there. In 1984, a man named Barry Clifford, a maritime archaeologist, found the Whydah. The ship's bell was recovered from the wreckage. This made the Whydah the first pirate shipwreck to be authorized beyond doubt. Since then, over 200,000 items have been recovered from the wreckage, including treasure. And on a very sad note, What was also recovered was a shoe, silk stocking, and a leg bone of either a 10 or 11-year-old boy. It had been reported that a young boy by the name of John King had joined the crew of Samuel to become a pirate, and he was one of the crew that drowned after the wreck. In 2018, divers believed that Samuel's remains were found, but DNA testing proved that it was not him. So, what became of Samuel's love, the woman that he became a pirate for and ultimately ended up dying for? The legend has it that before Samuel went to sea, he shared a night of passion with her, and that night produced a child. Flash forward months later, and she was found in a cold barn with a dead baby in her arms. Her community believed that she had killed her baby, so she was taken to the middle of town, tied to a post, and whipped. She was then imprisoned and tortured every day until she was put on trial. Then she was found guilty and executed. Legend says that one day she had a well-dressed and well-spoken visitor show up to her cell. He offered her freedom and revenge if she signed a contract. That man was the devil, and he made her the Sea Witch of Billingsgate. She lived inside a well that had a ship's light on its tail, and she used that light to lure ships onto land. And then she would prey on the sailors, and she would take their lives and souls. Some versions of the story say her ghost can still be seen on the shores of Cape Cod, and there she waits for her lover to return from sea to be with her once again. But, of course, that is just all legend. We are not sure she even existed. The only thing that can be said for sure is that there was a Mary Hallett that lived in Cape Cod in 1750. She died childless and unmarried in 1751. But was she the lover of the famous Black Sam? We don't know. Well, what about Samuel's legacy? Samuel is a character in the romance novel Pirate in My Arms by Danielle Harmon. The character Bellamy the hyena in the manga and TV series One Piece is named after Samuel. He is a character in the video game Assassin's Creed Pirates, and he is also featured in Netflix's docudrama series The Lost Pirate Kingdom. But like I mentioned on a previous episode, that docudrama series is not entirely accurate. And that was the life of Samuel Bellamy. Thank you so much for listening to the 10th episode of the 3rd season of History Shelf. There are 15 episodes planned for this season. Next week's episode is going to be about Edward Lowe. I hope you come back for that. A few things before we go. If you want to follow this podcast on social media, the TikTok is at History Shelf. The Twitter is at History Shelf Pod. The Instagram is at History_Shelf_pod. The Facebook page is History Shelf Podcast. And the Snapchat is History_Shelf. If you want to help out this podcast financially, there are a few ways you can do that. One is you can buy merch from the History Shelf merch store, or you can become a Patreon. This podcast is always going to be free, but there are some perks that come along with becoming a Patreon. The first tier is called History Student, and that is $1 a month. And with that, I will send out a shout out to you on all social media platforms that History Shelf is on. I will also choose one Patreon at random for each episode I do, and at the end of the episode, I will give that Patreon a shout out. The second tier is called History Fan, and that is $3 a month, and with that, you get the first tier, plus you get to vote in a poll that helps me choose the theme for the next season of this podcast. The third tier is called History Buff, and that is $20 a month, and with that you get the first 2 tiers, plus you get a handwritten note of thanks mailed to you from me. And the last tier is called History Lover, and that is $40 a month, and with that you get the first 3 tiers, plus you get to choose one item from the History Shelf merch store. You can choose anything that you want but the zip-up hoodie. You can also take out ad space on this podcast. I have a gig on Fiverr that lets you do that. There are also some affiliated links that you can click on that will help out the podcast. There is one for Riverside, one for Amazon, and one for Bookshop. But if you don't want any of the merch, and you don't want any of the perks, and you don't want to buy anything, but you still want to help out this podcast, I have turned on listener support on Spotify for podcasters. The links to everything that I just mentioned will be in the episode description for this episode. But as always, the best way that you can support this podcast is to continue to listen to it. And there are a few other ways that you can help out this podcast for free. One is if you are listening on a platform that lets you rate this podcast 5 stars and or leave a positive review. If you do that, that would be very helpful. Also, sharing this podcast on social media with your friends and family would be very helpful. All right, well, until next time, keep learning, keep loving history, and come back for next week's episode. Bye.